Nowadays, we mostly discuss well-known serial killers and criminals whose stories are told by the dozens, but few know anything about the lesser, known yet no less horrific serial killers of Russia. How many stories do you know about school children who became brutal serial killers at a young age? Surely many are familiar with names like Arkady Nieland, who was executed for 2 murders in the USSR at the age of 15, or Vladimir Vinikovsky, who had committed 8 brutal murders by the time he was just 16. And now it is time to talk about another brutal serial killer who made a name for himself in criminal history at the age of 16 when he first abused and killed a grandmother. Be sure to watch the video until the end, because I promise you the ending will surprise you greatly. Recently, YouTube has stopped recommending this channel, so I would like each of you to like the video now and leave a comment so we can crack YouTube's algorithms. If you don't like the video or want to stop watching, you can unlike it at any time. I would like to remind you that you are not judging the horrific story but my work on the video. Now let's get started. The funeral of a young man involves tears, alcohol, and then something completely wild, something a human being is seemingly incapable of. Right at the wake, one of the guests first seduces the widow. Later, he rapes the deceased's elderly mother in front of her and brutally kills her. To cover his tracks, the perpetrator sets fire to the house where the drunken guests are sleeping. This is not a script for a film yet to be shot, but the end of a murderer's bloody path that began behind the walls of a 1-room apartment in Tula. If the killer is not stopped, each of his subsequent atrocities will be even more horrific. Once initiated, the process of losing one's human form is irreversible without medical or legal intervention. This was also true in the case of a serial killer who only attracted elderly women. An old worn boot lying next to a monument, a headscarf hanging from a fence, a holy umbrella among graves. All of this is material evidence of a series of gruesome crimes committed in Tula in the 1990s. No other criminal case contains as many photographs of cemeteries as this one. The killer found most of his victims, elderly women, in the cemetery among the graves. In the deathly silence, he forced them to perform sexual acts and then took their lives. But let's start from the very beginning. The year was 1989 in Tula. One day, a worker at a flour factory arrived for her evening shift. She was usually greeted by her replacement, but the building was silent. When she went into the next room, she was met with a horrific sight as a blood-soaked corpse lay on the floor. Investigators quickly arrived at the crime scene and identified the victim as Valentina Mukhina, a waiter at the flour factory. The woman was only a few weeks away from retirement. The first question was why the innocent Valentina was killed, and then the experts called in made a shocking statement that the elderly woman had been abused before her death. Investigators managed to reconstruct the sequence of events which suggested Valentina Mukhina was at her workplace, probably sitting at her desk waiting for the next grain delivery, when she was attacked by an unknown assailant. But attacking someone, especially in broad daylight and almost in front of other employees, is very risky. Initial suspicion fell on someone from her own circle. The question remained regarding who hated the elderly Valentina Mukhina. The news of the brutal incident paralyzed work in the factory. All employees were horrified, the superiors were perplexed, and everyone asked themselves the same question. This was the beginning of a terrible story that lasted several years and kept all the inhabitants of the city in fear. Investigators put forward one theory after another, wondering if the abuse was the main reason for the attack, or if the monster wanted to rob its victim but lost control in the face of her helplessness and fear. However, a mill is hardly a place criminals would specifically go to. On the evening of the day the body was found, the murder weapon, which was a stone, was also found. All the workers were checked to see who was where at the time of the crime. After several dozen people had been questioned, a man told an interesting story that had happened a year earlier. That day, Valentina Mukhina noticed that one of the drivers was behaving very strangely as he had difficulty getting out of the cab, as if something was hindering him. The woman looked into the cab, where there was a bag on the passenger seat, but she couldn't look inside because the driver was coming back. Valentina raised the alarm because the strange man had worried her greatly. As he was about to leave, he was stopped by factory workers who demanded he show the bag. The driver grabbed a car jack and appeared to resist a search, but eventually someone put their hand inside the bag and the young man pulled out a chicken. One might think why anyone would do such a thing, but a few days later the same driver tried to smuggle a sack of flour out of the factory and was caught. Valentina demanded that the police be called, to which the perpetrator shouted that she should be careful that a brick doesn't fall on her head. The investigation continued and a suspect emerged. It turned out that the man had been sentenced to a year in prison for attempting to steal a sack of flour and had just been released from prison the day before the brutal act. The suspect, Shcharbina, was found and brought to the police station for questioning. Investigators determined that the seemingly obvious perpetrator had been released from prison only 2 days after the attack on Mukina, making it impossible for him to have committed the attack. The investigation lasted almost a year with no new leads, evidence, or witnesses. The investigators reached a dead end and were ready to close the case due to a lack of evidence and suspects. But after 11 months, the case took an unexpected turn when a lifeless body was found in a river. On a November day at the age of 45, Albina Boldareva was walking home from work. The woman always took the same route, crossing a bridge she knew well. But that evening everything changed. Quick steps approached Boldareva, who couldn't even turn around before a knife was stabbed in her back. The killer had planned everything meticulously, knowing the people from the nearby factory had already passed by, and that in the next few hours no one would stop him from completing his plan. But he had miscalculated on one point, and thanks to this the investigation finally made progress. That evening, 2 female workers stayed at the factory after their shift to paint a wall newspaper for an important event and left later than everyone else. When they reached the bridge, they encountered a horrific sight where a man was trying to undress a half-dead woman and, hearing noises, fled hastily. Albina Boldareva was found still alive. The 2 factory workers helped the woman up, carried her to the street, and flagged down a car. At the hospital she lost consciousness, and doctors determined that the maniac had abused his victim. The perpetrator's modus operandi was very similar to the case that had occurred a year earlier. The injured Boldareva was unconscious most of the night, but regained consciousness during the day. Police officers guarded the door and the doctors allowed investigators to speak with her. The woman told law enforcement that the perpetrator was very young, wore a knitted cap pulled over his eyes, and had rubber shoes with rolled-up cuffs on his feet. There were few details that could be used to identify a suspect, and no further clues were found at the crime scene, not even footprints. The only way to identify the tormentor was by his face. The investigators checked all those previously convicted of similar crimes and searched all the files on suspected men who were receiving psychiatric treatment. Hundreds of people came under suspicion, including many young men with abnormalities, but after one day the investigators' last hopes collapsed when a call came from the hospital stating that the patient had died. No one could identify the perpetrator, and the investigation stalled again. Time passed and more than 4 months had passed since the last attack. Over time the terrible incident on the bridge over the Voronka River was forgotten, but a new crime revived the memory of the 2 gruesome murders. On March 18, 1991, 51-year-old Natalia Pryaniknikova was walking from the train station toward her home through the woods. Everything was quiet until a young man approached her. He looked suspicious as he walked slowly and looked Natalia straight in the eyes. The woman thought he was going to snatch her purse and held on to it, but the unknown man pulled out a knife. Everything went completely differently than the criminal had planned because the woman was nimble and hit him with her purse first, causing the knife to fall from his hand. The murderer was so surprised by this defense that he was paralyzed. Natalia had no idea at the time that she would be able to fend off a criminal whom by then the entire town was already afraid of. The robbery in the woods ended in a fiasco for the criminal, and moreover he made a huge mistake by running away and leaving behind the knife he had used to kill his previous victim. This gave the investigators a crucial piece of evidence. Experts determined that the knife was homemade. Natalia reported that the perpetrator had a very strange gait. The search radius was shrinking, but there were still no suspects, and the killer himself had no intention of stopping. The brutal murderer usually took long breaks before committing his next crime, but this time, apparently frustrated by his failure, he attacked a new victim after just 5 days. This time the victim was unable to escape the killer. The body was found near the crime scene where the perpetrator had attacked his victim from behind, abused her, and killed her. The investigators were baffled as 2 years of searching had passed, and the killer was still at large. They decided to focus on the murder weapon they had found. The knife was unusually made, consisting of a metal pin wrapped in insulating tape, with the blade itself welded to the fitting. In those years, welding machines were only available in factories, which further narrowed the pool of suspects. A few days later, the investigator managed to find another woman who almost became the next victim. However, she did not go to the police immediately because the perpetrator was unable to attack her due to the timely arrival of passers-by. The investigator tried to elicit more details from the witness, but she could not remember anything. However, she did know a very strange story that could finally help solve the case that had remained unsolved for over 2 years. And now we are nearing the end, so if you have watched this far, perhaps you like my work and deserve a subscription to the channel. The woman told the investigator that there was a student at School 13 who had held a teacher in the restroom. This story needed to be confirmed, and the investigator was able to determine that this incident had indeed occurred, only it had been kept secret from the police. The high school student had attacked the deputy headmistress in the school restroom late at night and began to tear off her clothes. Suddenly she realized the attacker was one of their students. The boy panicked and ran away. The scandal was covered up, although the entire school learned of the incident. The unusual case piqued the interest of law enforcement officials, especially since they had already tracked down the killer. Parallel to the strange story from school number 13, investigators came to the locomotive plant to inquire if anyone had recently made a knife there. It turned out that a few months earlier a young man had asked to weld a blade onto a fitting to make a knife. The boy's description matched that of the attacker and was identified as Sergei. The investigator who came to his apartment asked one of the residents if he knew 17-year-old Sergei. The resident pointed to a teenager standing next to him and said that was him. No one could believe that the small, thin teenager who had just graduated from school was a brutal maniac. It was decided to search his apartment. Initially, small clues were found such as a knitted hat and rubber boots, which the second victim had described, but the evidence was indirect and wasn't enough to prosecute. The only surviving victim, who had defended herself against her attackers, didn't dare go for identification because she feared he might have friends. Law enforcement officers eventually managed to persuade the victim to come along. However, at the moment of identification, the woman didn't point at anyone. But the strangest thing was yet to come because the killer recognized his victim himself. It seemed as if everything was over and the criminal had been caught. He would be convicted and the video could be turned off. But believe me, the worst part of this story is yet to come. Sergei thought the victim had survived and had nothing to fear, so he confessed. Beyond that, Sukhanov was identified by depot employees who had provided him with a knife and later by flour factory workers. Sergei Nikolaevich Sukhanov was born on June 22, 1973 in Tula and was the only child of a troubled family. His father had legal troubles and a criminal record. Sukhanov Jr. lived with his parents and paternal grandmother in a one-room apartment. The retired woman was strict and constantly criticized him, provoking conflicts. So Sergei grew up in a socially difficult environment. As a result, as a teenager, Sukhanov began to exhibit deviant behavior and signs of misogyny toward older women who were powerfully built and resembled his grandmother. Sukhanov attended school number 13. In 1988, Sergei attacked the teacher in the school restroom and attempted to sexually assault her. However, the teacher recognized Sukhanov and he was forced to flee. The incident was kept secret from the police. However, Sukhanov was registered in a psychiatric hospital and subjected to a forensic psychiatric examination, which declared him sane. During one of the examinations, he stated that his motive for the attack was revenge for poor grades, but during the fight, she aroused him, and he decided to attack her. After the examination, the future killer returned to school, where he soon began enticing one of his classmates to engage in lewd acts, and when she rejected him, Sergei showed signs of mental disorder. At that time, there was only one punishment for brutal assaults on women, but there was a catch because all of this didn't apply to a juvenile. Since Sergei was only 17 at the time of his arrest, he could only be sentenced to 10 years in prison. It seemed like the story was over and the killer had been caught and convicted. But no. 7 years later, in 1998, the city was shaken again because someone had once again hunted elderly women, but this time in the city cemetery. Pensioners came to tend the graves of their relatives and were killed. The first victim was 69 years old, the second 79, and the third 82. The elderly women were not only killed, but also abused, and all the murders were committed with particular cruelty. All investigators immediately remembered the name Sergei Sukhanov, as it was his signature. A check revealed that the convict was still serving his sentence, and therefore could not possibly have committed all these murders. So they thought there really was a new serial killer in the city. Ambushes were set up in cemeteries where investigators posing as visitors and local workers constantly lingered in the vicinity searching for suspicious men. But all this was to no avail. Soon after, a fourth murder occurred involving a grandmother who was 86 years old. The whole city was in a panic, and local newspapers wrote about a new serial killer, making pensioners afraid to go out on the streets, let alone visit the cemetery. The situation in Tula was very tense. Investigators had to arrest dozens of men again, check them, and release them again as if history were repeating itself. A few weeks later, while investigators were conducting all sorts of checks, a call came in from a woman who had smelled burning and went to her neighbor's house. The door was unlocked, and upon entering, she encountered a sight she will never forget. The mirrors in the house were covered, and there was complete silence. What had happened in that house was inhumane, and unfortunately something like that cannot be fully described even on YouTube. Crosses and stars had been carved on the bodies, and their breasts had been removed. This terrified all the police officers so much that many were put on sick leave after seeing the crime scene. Gradually, investigators figured out who might have been involved in this gruesome crime and questioned all neighbors and acquaintances. An already familiar name emerged in the case: Sukhanov. How could this be? Investigators sent an inquiry, and according to the documents, he was in prison, where he still had to serve at least 3 years. Now the documents were no longer enough for the law enforcement authorities, so they went to the prison to make sure the cruel monster was behind bars. How great was their surprise when he wasn't there. One of the rank and file officers had been negligent and hadn't determined Sukhanov's exact whereabouts or in which penal colony he was located. As it turned out, he had been released early for good behavior, but now a new problem arose regarding where to look for a murderer who already knew how to hide from investigators. This turned out to be easy because on March 29, 1999, Sergei Sukhanov was arrested. After his arrest, a blood sample was taken, and after 18 days the criminal finally confessed. By then, the results of the DNA test had proven his involvement in all the crimes. The murderer remembered exactly where and how he had attacked his victims, as well as what he had said during interrogations and reconstructive procedures. He was also identified by cemetery staff as the murderer of one of the victims. During interrogations, he stated that his mental disorder was the motive for all the crimes. Sergei insisted that he suffered from a split personality and had problems with self-control. The killer blamed his grandmother, who had scolded him as a child, and his cramped room in which he could not find peace. In the middle of the same year, Sergei Sukhanov's lawyer requested a forensic psychiatric examination at a court hearing to determine his sanity, which was approved. At the end of the same year, Sukhanov was examined at the Serbsky Institute of Psychiatry, where he was treated by specialists for the following 2 months. Based on a series of psychiatric reports, it was determined that Sergei Sukhanov suffered from a particularly dangerous form of schizophrenia, which made him unable to recognize his actions as socially dangerous at the time of the crime. On this basis, on January 20, 2000, the regional court declared Sergei Sukhanov insane, exonerated him from criminal responsibility, and sent him for compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital with intensive monitoring in the city of Oral. There was much talk that the killer should have been shot the first time, but at that time such a punishment could not be imposed on juveniles. There has been only one case in history involving 15-year-old Arkady Nieland, and you can find a video about it on my channel. Sergei Sukhanov is alive and undergoing compulsory treatment, which he will continue until the end of his life. He is now over 50 years old. Thanks for watching and take care.